Have you ever looked through old photo albums and found yourself thinking that some of the faces in the pictures seem strange? Some people look too tense, while others, on the contrary, are almost perfectly calm. Sometimes it seems as if some mystery has frozen in their eyes. Now imagine that among these photos could be people who are no longer alive. In this video, we will delve into the eerie world of posthumous photography. You will learn why in the 19th century, parents took pictures of their children after they died, how they painted them, put them in chairs, and even painted their eyes to create the illusion of life. We will tell you about dolls made from the hair and clothes of the deceased, which remained in the family as a living memory. You will see how families pose near coffins as if it were an ordinary family photo, and how sometimes it is impossible to distinguish in the pictures who is alive and who is dead. We will also remember about spiritual photography, when ghosts appeared in the photos, and people sincerely believed that this was evidence of life after death. And the scariest thing is that all this was not a random curiosity, but a real industry that flourished for decades in Europe and America. This is a story where horror and reality are intertwined. And perhaps after watching it, you will never look at old photos the same way again. In the 19th century, death was a daily occurrence. Diseases, epidemics, and the lack of medicine, and children suffered the most from it. That is why post-mortem photography most often involved toddlers. For parents, it was the only photo that remained after the child's death. Photographers turned death into an illusion of life. Babies were placed in a cradle or in their mother's arms. Older children were placed on a chair, supported with metal structures so that the body would not fall. They applied blush to their cheeks, combed their hair, and put a favorite toy in their hands. And if it was impossible to open their eyes, they were simply painted over in the picture. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary family portrait. The child was in festive clothes with his mother or siblings nearby. But if you look closely, everything becomes obvious. The body is too still, the gaze is frozen, and there is a coldness around the photo. For us today, these shots look eerie. But in the 19th century, they were a symbol of love and memory. The last chance to save face for someone who will never take the first step or say the first word again. When photography was too expensive or impossible, people looked for other ways to preserve memories. This is how an even more eerie custom appeared: memory dolls made from deceased children. Parents ordered a doll from craftsmen that resembled their child as closely as possible. They used real hair, dressed the doll in their favorite dresses or shirts. Some craftsmen copied the facial features so accurately that the doll looked as if the child was simply sleeping. Sometimes these dolls were made of plaster or fabric, but there were cases when real body parts were sewn into the product: strands of hair, pieces of clothing, sometimes even nails. Such substitutes became part of the house. They were seated at the table during holidays, placed in the baby's bed, photographed with the rest of the family. For the parents, it was an illusion that their child was still there. For an outsider, the scene looked strange. A doll with dead features sat among the living. In some cultures, these dolls were even passed down as heirlooms, as a reminder of a deceased family member. Looking at old photographs today, it is difficult to understand whether this is a living child or a doll made after death. To us, this seems terrifying. But in the 19th century, it was a way to soothe pain, and at the same time, another attempt to defeat death, albeit in such a terrible form. Death was not always tried to be hidden or disguised as sleep. In many families, it was customary to take pictures right next to the coffin. This was not a staged event, but a real farewell scene that they wanted to preserve forever. In such photos, the whole family gathered around the deceased. The coffin was placed in the middle of the room or even in the yard so that there was more light for shooting. The mother could sit next to her, holding the child's hand. The husband could stand behind his wife's coffin. Sometimes the photographer captured the moment when all the relatives were standing nearby, looking into the camera with an expression of grief. These shots are striking in that they do not try to create the illusion of life. On the contrary, death is displayed openly. The body lies in a coffin, often decorated with flowers, and nearby are living people who seem to have accepted this reality. For us, it looks wild, but then it was a symbol of respect and love. Children were especially often photographed this way. Small coffins were decorated with lace, placed in the center of the room, and a photograph of a brother or sister who did not yet understand what was happening was taken next to them. For parents, it was a difficult but necessary photo. A separate genre of post-mortem photos was called sleeping. Here, death was tried to be hidden under the illusion of rest. The deceased were placed on a sofa or in bed, covered with pillows and covered with blankets. A book or flowers were placed in their hands to create a scene of peaceful sleep. Children were especially often photographed this way. They lay in their cradles as if they were just dozing off. To an outsider, this is a touching portrait, but the truth was completely different. Some photos look so realistic that even historians argue whether this child is sleeping or already dead. And this is the greatest horror. The thin line between life and death was almost erased.
The longer I study Victorian postmortem photographs, the more difficult it is to distinguish where life ends and death begins. Some of the pictures are so skillfully staged that even an experienced researcher has to peer closely to understand whether this child is sleeping or already dead. And perhaps this is precisely the horror. An era that feared death made it too dreamlike.
To take a picture, photographers often used special supports for the head and body because the dead person could not lie naturally. All this had one goal: to preserve the illusion. And for parents, such an illusion was more important than the truth. Today, these shots cause a creepy feeling. They look peaceful only at first glance. But if you look closely, you feel that before you is not a dream, but death, frozen for a moment in a photograph. In the second half of the 19th century, when the fascination with spiritualism swept across Europe and America, photography took on another eerie role. The so-called spiritual portraits appeared, pictures in which the ghosts of the dead allegedly appeared alongside the living. Photographers used long exposures, double exposures, or simply tricks with the film. As a result, transparent faces, shadows, or figures in white robes appeared behind people's backs in the pictures. And the customers believed that these were their relatives who had returned from the world of the dead to appear in the picture. Such photos became a real sensation. Widows saw a ghostly husband next to them. Mothers, the ghosts of their children. And although today we understand that this was a technical manipulation, then for many it was proof. Life after death exists. The scariest thing about these photos is not the ghosts themselves, but that people believed in their reality. They paid a lot of money to see the faces of those who are no longer there. And even if it was just an illusion, for them it had enormous value. Today, when you look at such pictures, you get a double feeling. On the one hand, you can see the primitive photo montage, and on the other, you feel the real pain and longing of people who wanted to maintain a connection with the dead at all costs. When photography first appeared, it was not as fast and accessible as it is today. Any frame required a long process, and often it was the photographer's skill that determined how the memory of the deceased would look. That is why a whole fashion for retouching and finishing appeared, a kind of 19th century Photoshop. Photographers took the negative and added what was missing on it. They painted the cheeks to make the face look more alive, painted open eyes if they were closed. Sometimes they even drew a slight smile, as if the dead person was smiling at his family. But it was not limited to this. If the deceased did not have time to photograph him, the masters could finish him in an already finished family portrait. Dozens of paintings and photos have been preserved in the archives, where, next to living parents or children, a painted figure is visible, who in fact had been dead for a long time. For the family, this was the only way to maintain integrity, to pretend that everyone was still together. For us today, such pictures look eerie, the living and the dead side by side, but the reality is hidden under a layer of paint and deception. By the end of the 19th century, post-mortem photography had become a real business. In cities, studios appeared that only made last portraits. Advertisements were printed in newspapers, and photographers sold catalogs with poses for dead to make death look like life. Poor families gave their last money for a single shot. The rich ordered a series. Photos of the deceased stood next to wedding photos in the same albums. People did not run away from death. They let it into the house, photographed it, and kept it next to the living. Today it seems creepy, but these pictures are a reminder of how close life and death were then. This is a story that you will not find on Google. Subscribe to learn even more dark facts that history hides.